There are secrets never written in history. Things hidden beneath gold, beneath perfume, and beneath the frozen smile of a queen. Centurilateur. When people speak of the reign of Elizabeth I, they see only the brilliance of her power, the glittering gowns, the lavish feasts, the golden throne of a nation that shaped the world. Yet few know that behind that splendor, her palace reeked so badly that the very queen, the most admired woman in Europe, shuddered every time she walked its halls. The 16th century had no bathrooms, no soap, no sewage systems, and people believed that water carried disease. The royal palace of England, symbol of civilization and power. It was in truth a place full of filth, urine, and the stench of hundreds of unwashed bodies, pressed together behind closed doors. Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was born into the smell of betrayal and blood. She saw her mother executed when she was only 3, grew up surrounded by suspicion, and was treated as a cursed child. When she finally ascended the throne in the year 1558, Elizabeth had learned one lesson: power did not come from swords or crowns, but from the way others perceived her. And so, in an age when most of Europe lived in the odor of rot and sweat, Elizabeth turned fragrance into a weapon of politics. Her first decree was not about taxes or wars, but about scent. From then on, anyone who smelled unpleasant noble, ambassador, or royal alike was forbidden to enter the queen's chambers. No one could approach her unless they carried the scent of grace. In the blood-soaked Tudor court, no one had ever dared make sweetness into law. Witnesses said that on mornings at Hampton Court, before the queen appeared, her maids would scatter rose powder on the floors, wash the tables with wine, steeped in petals, and burn lavender in the corners to mask the smell of men. Elizabeth entered like a vision, her gown soaked in oils, her wig dusted with scented powder, her gloves dripping with rose water. When she passed by, people didn't just see a queen, they smelled authority. Perfume became her invisible armor, a wall dividing her from the ordinary world. In an age when even princes stank like peasants, Elizabeth floated through the air like a being, not made of flesh but of fragrance. But every obsession has its root. Elizabeth's hatred of foul smells was not vanity. It was born of terror, of decay. Death was never far in Tudor. England heads on pikes, corpses hanging over London Bridge, plaques devouring villages, and the memory of her mother's body buried without honor. To her, bad smells were not merely unpleasant, they were the odor of death, of corruption, of treason. And so she vowed her court would never carry that scent. Her palaces, from Whitehall to Windsor, became temples of perfume, where rosewater replaced blood and incense replaced prayer. The nobility soon learned to live by scent. They imported exotic oils from the East: musk, ambergris, civet crushed roses and lavender to make powders, soaked fabrics in white wine, and hung them in sunlight. The entire court became a factory of fragrance. Yet this fragrance, symbol of purity, was also a mask. Beneath the layers of powder and perfume were bodies poisoned by lead, mouths rotting behind red lipstick, and souls trapped in a silence so tight they hardly dared breathe. Some scholars believe Elizabeth suffered from osmophobia, a pathological fear of smell. Perhaps she did. Or perhaps she understood something no one else did, that scent controls emotion. When you entered her presence, you had to smell perfect, which meant you had to obey. Perfume became a form of political language: rose for loyalty, leona for virtue, and any strange odor for betrayal. The court of Elizabeth was not ruled by words or decrees, but by aroma, and that, more than any naval victory or royal marriage, made her one of the most powerful rulers in history. She redefined the meaning of purity itself. In her later years, as the white lead on her face began to crack and her teeth fell away from poison, people still said the queen smelled of sweetness. But by then, and that scent was no longer the scent of roses, it was the scent of time itself, of power melting away, of a woman who tried to perfume away mortality. When she breathed her last in the year 1603, the room was thick with lavender smoke. The courtiers wept, but perhaps only a few realized that for the first time in 45 years, the English court no longer smelled of perfume, but of a human being. Elizabeth I was gone, yet her legacy lingers in every drop of perfume, every whisper of scent drifting through Buckingham's halls, every gala where nobles still try to smell divine. She was not only the Virgin Queen, she was the queen of fragrance, the woman who turned scent into power, purity, and obsession. From her fear of stench, she built a culture where people live to be smelled, where the fragrance of roses is the fragrance of dominance. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the grave, Elizabeth still smiles, surrounded by endless perfume, finally at peace in the only paradise she ever believed, in a world that smells of beauty and control. The palace did not sleep, not even at night. Beneath its golden ceilings, the walls breathed like a living creature soaked with moisture, sweat, and the lingering scent of hundreds of bodies pressed together in the name of glory. But for Elizabeth, this was no palace. It was a cage of odors. Each corridor reminded her that beauty and filth were separated only by a thin veil of perfume. The stench of the 16th century was not an accident of time. It was a symptom of civilization itself, a world that had yet to understand that cleanliness could be power. While kings across Europe bathed in musk and arrogance, Elizabeth turned the act of smelling pleasant into a weapon of hierarchy. The courtiers called it her law of scent, a decree so unspoken yet so absolute that even ambassadors trembled before stepping into her presence. They whispered that she could smell deceit before it was spoken. She could walk through a hall and know, from the air itself, who had dared to break her command. Her nose was the first court of justice. Those who approached her carried sachets of dried flowers in their sleeves, soaked their gloves in perfume until the fabric darkened, and rubbed scented oils into their hair to disguise the human smell that betrayed them. And yet, the queen's face never softened. She would close her eyes, inhale once, and in that small gesture, decide who was pure enough to remain in her court. To the nobles who worshipped her, this ritual was divine. To those who feared her, it was witchcraft. In her private chambers, the queen's obsession became ritualized. Theater, servants filled copper basins with wine and petals, and when the doors were sealed, Elizabeth's maids washed her hands in rosewater, wiped her face with cloth soaked in lavender, and brushed her hair with oils infused with ambergris and musk. Her garments were steeped in fragrance for days before she wore them. Even her letters were sealed with wax that carried her personal scent. The smell of Elizabeth became an empire in itself, a fragrance so distinct that courtiers could sense her presence before she appeared. The scent preceded her like a royal banner. It was not just pleasant, it was command. A declaration that she was above decay, above mortality. But within that scented paradise, there was fear. The fear of being human. The courtiers, trapped in the queen's fragrant tyranny, began to lose the ability to breathe freely. Some fell ill from the heavy use of oils and powders. their skin pale and raw beneath layers of scented dust. Yet no one dared complain. To sweat, to stink, to be natural was to be unworthy. Men who once fought wars now drowned themselves in rosewater. Women, desperate to mimic the queen's grace, filled their chambers with bowls of vinegar and herbs, hoping to cleanse the air of the world's rot. They lived not for virtue, but for aroma. Elizabeth's palace was not a sanctuary of beauty. It was a battlefield between nature and artifice. Outside, the city of London festered in the stench of open sewers and dying animals. The Thames carried the waste of thousands, and the smell could travel miles. Inside, the Queen waged her silent war against it, an endless crusade fought with perfume bottles and scented candles. The irony was cruel. No matter how many herbs burned, no matter how many rose petals steeped in wine, the palace could not escape the truth of its own decay. The perfumes did not erase the filth, they transformed it. The scent of roses and rot became indistinguishable, blending into one another like two halves of the same sin. Those who served her began to believe that fragrance was holiness. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and Venice competed to present her with rare oils and new formulas, gifts meant to please her nose and her pride. The French brought jasmine, the Venetians brought ambergris, the Ottomans offered civet musk from Africa. Each vial was an offering to a new kind of goddess, the goddess of purity and control. Elizabeth accepted them all, not out of vanity, but because she understood their power. In a time when diplomacy often failed with swords, she conquered through scent. Her palace became the center of a new kind of empire, an empire that ruled not by fear or faith, but by fragrance. Yet beneath the layers of perfume, the Queen's loneliness deepened. Her courtiers adored her, but could not touch her. Her throne was surrounded by men, but none could approach her without permission. Even her closest ladies were required to perfume themselves before tending to her. The Queen's sense of isolation was absolute. She lived in a world where everything human was filtered through scent, purified until it was unrecognizable. She once confided to her physician that she could no longer bear the smell of flesh, not even her own. That confession, if it ever reached the world, would have destroyed the myth of the Virgin Queen. For what was virginity but another way of saying untouchable at night? When the torches dimmed and the corridors emptied, the air in her bedchamber thickened with the perfume of the day, the residue of roses, musk, and fear. She would sit before her mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman both divine and decaying. The scent that once promised immortality now clung to her skin like a ghost she could not exorcise. The lead makeup she used to perfect her image poisoned her blood, and the perfumes mixed with it, forming an invisible mask of slow death. Yet she would not stop. To be human, to smell like one, would be worse than dying. And so she continued to bathe in fragrance, a queen embalming herself while still alive. The irony was that Elizabeth's obsession made England cleaner. Her courtiers, terrified of offending her nose, began to adopt her habits. They built bathhouses, imported soups, and commissioned local apothecaries to create domestic perfumes. The culture of scent that she imposed became a form of progress, pushing England toward a modern idea of hygiene. What began as a queen's madness evolved into a revolution of manners. Cleanliness became civilization, and perfume became identity. Even after her death, the aristocracy maintained the rituals she had birthed: the scented gloves, the perfumed wigs, the flowered corridors. Elizabeth's ghost lingered in every whiff of lavender, drifting through the halls of the English court. Still, to those who knew her intimately. And the queen's perfumes were not symbols of luxury, they were armor. Behind each carefully layered scent lay a woman haunted by memory. Every time she inhaled rose, she smelled her mother's blood on the scaffold. Every time she burned incense, she remembered the pyres of the Protestant martyrs. Her cleanliness was not about beauty, it was about control. It was how she remade the world into something bearable. Her perfumed court was a way to rewrite history, to cover the stench of all that England had done in its thirst for power. The fragrance was not escape, it was atonement. The courtiers who survived her reign would later speak of her presence with both awe and dread. She was like sunlight trapped in a bottle of wine. One wrote, "Sweet, intoxicating, and fatal." Her scent lingered on their clothes for days after an audience, as if she had branded them invisible. They called it the mark of favor. Yet many confessed that it also carried something else, an unease they could not name. The feeling that behind every rose hid the memory of rot. Perhaps they sensed that the Queen's war against smell was really a war against mortality itself. Perfume was her rebellion against the inevitability of decay. By the time Elizabeth reached her 70th year, the line between the woman and the fragrance had disappeared. The scent was no longer decoration, it was identity. She had become her own myth, a queen whose presence was as intoxicating as it was suffocating. The younger generation, born into her scented empire, could not imagine a ruler without perfume. They copied her rituals with reverence, not realizing that what they imitated was not refinement, but fear. The palace remained the same, polished, perfumed, and haunted. The courtiers still perfumed their hands before touching a quill, and still anointed their wigs before attending the royal chamber. But the air was heavy now, heavy with history, with the invisible burden of a queen who refused to let anything rot. Somewhere within those walls, the ghost of Elizabeth still breathed through the lavender smoke, whispering that to smell human is to admit defeat. And so the legend endured: the queen who could not stand the stench of life, who perfumed her world until it forgot what being alive smelled like. Yet perhaps that was her greatest victory. She had lived in a time of filth and turned it into fragrance, ruled a kingdom of rot and made it believe it was clean. The palace that once smelled of death now reeked of roses. And though both scents were lies, the second was the lie the world preferred to remember. There is a strange kind of silence that settles over a palace when the scent becomes stronger than the sound. By the third decade of Elizabeth's reign, England itself smelled different. What had once been the odor of wet cobblestone, tar, sweat, and disease was slowly replaced by the air of rosewater and powdered wigs. Markets began to sell lavender sachets beside bread. Nobles competed not for titles, but for the privilege of wearing the Queen's signature scent. Perfume had become more than adornment. It was currency, hierarchy, even theology. To smell like Elizabeth was to exist within her orbit. To smell otherwise was to risk being forgotten by history. The transformation began in quiet corners of the palace. Apothecaries who once mixed medicines were now crafting elixirs of attraction and devotion. The recipes were whispered like scripture: crushed rose petals, orris root, ambergris, musk, and sometimes a drop of something rarer: whale secretion, civet oil, or even the smoke from burning spices brought from the East Indies. These perfumes were not meant for the people. They were meant for those who wanted to be close to the Queen, to inhale her power. Servants who brushed her gowns said the scent clung to them for days, lingering on their skin long after the fabric was folded away. Some believed the smell itself had magic, a charm that could protect against betrayal or bad fortune. In a world that equated odor with morality, fragrance became faith. Elizabeth herself understood this better than anyone. Every morning, her preparations were a ceremony of control. The dressing ritual took hours first. The cleansing with rosewater and wine. Then the brushing of hair with perfumed oils, followed by the layering of fabrics steeped in scent. Her body became a vessel. Her clothes, an altar. Courtiers waiting outside could hear the soft rhythm of her attendants. The pouring of liquid into crystal bottles. The rustle of silk and whisper of petals as the queen's form was rebuilt from the invisible. When she emerged, she did not simply appear, she emanated. The scent filled the air ahead of her like a herald's trumpet, warning everyone to stand straighter, to breathe shallower. It was the perfume of command, one that lingered in the mind longer than her words. But perfume was more than indulgence. It was policy. To maintain, it required a network that stretched beyond England's shores. The merchants of Venice shipped oils through storms. Sailors braved disease to fetch rare spices from India and Arabia. And diplomats negotiated access to exotic ingredients as though they were trading for weapons. Behind every vial of perfume lay the labor of a dozen men, the death of a dozen others. It was an empire of invisible suffering, all to feed the queen's desire for purity. And yet, in this paradox, England found profit. The trade in fragrance became a pillar of commerce. Local apothecaries flourished, and a generation of perfumers emerged, crafting mixtures inspired by the queen's own blends. The court, however, was suffocating under its own sweetness. Visitors described the great halls as heavy with odor, the air dense enough to taste. Perfume, meant to conceal decay, had become decay itself. Servants fainted from the fumes, and fires broke out from candles left burning near volatile oils. Still, no one dared change the ritual. The queen's scent was sacred. It defined her reign as surely as her navy or her speeches. She had turned fragrance into governance, a law of aesthetics more binding than any charter. Outside the palace, the common people followed suit, though their perfumes were simpler, vinegar infused with herbs, lavender boiled in rainwater, or linen hung in fields of wild thyme. They could not afford civet or ambergris, but they could imitate the ritual. Bathing, once viewed with suspicion, to become fashionable again. The air of London began to shift. By the end of the century, even the poor spoke of cleanliness as a virtue, of fragrance as a mark of progress. The queen's obsession had seeped into the pores of her nation. Yet amid this transformation, Elizabeth's loneliness grew unbearable. The more she perfumed herself, the more distant she became from the people she ruled. Every scent that covered her body also erased her humanity. Courtiers praised her purity, her divine air, her unearthly calm, but behind those compliments was fear. They no longer saw a woman, they saw an icon, a creature above the senses. In her chambers, surrounded by rosewater and candlelight, Elizabeth began to lose the ability to smell anything natural. The human odor, once offensive, and now felt like memory, something lost, something almost tender. She began to wonder, in private moments, whether the world she had created was too sterile for love. Once, during an audience with an ambassador from France, the man entered without properly perfuming himself. The moment he knelt, Elizabeth's expression changed. Witnesses said she turned pale and silent, then gestured for him to stand back. She did not shout. She simply turned away. And the message was clearer than any punishment. The man was expelled from court within a week. His misstep became legend, the tale of the ambassador who smelled like rain and exile. After that, no one forgot again. The Queen's law of scent was as feared as her intelligence. As years passed, the culture of perfume took on a spiritual meaning. Alchemists spoke of scent as the soul of matter, invisible yet immortal. Philosophers claimed that fragrance was proof of divine order, that heaven itself must smell of amber and rose. For Elizabeth, these ideas were comforting. She had no husband, no child to carry her blood. But she had scent, and scent could not die. Long after her body would rot in the ground, her fragrance would linger in memory. She told one of her ladies that to leave behind a scent was to leave behind a trace of the soul. It was the closest thing to eternity a mortal could claim. But eternity, like perfume, evaporates. The very oils that preserved her beauty began to poison her. The lead in her makeup burned her skin. The scented powders choked her lungs. Her physicians begged her to reduce her rituals, but she refused to appear without fragrance. She said, would be to appear unfinished, unclean, unfit to rule. In truth, she feared that without scent she would vanish, as though her entire being depended on that invisible veil. And perhaps it did. The Queen who once ruled the world by smell was now ruled by it. Still, she carried herself with the same grace, the same careful distance. The scent around her remained divine, though beneath it, her body was failing. She became frail, her voice softer, her steps slower. But the fragrance never wavered. It was as if the perfume had taken her place, an invisible double that stood in for the Queen when her flesh could not. When visitors bowed, they bowed to the smell before they saw her face. The legend of Elizabeth the Fragrant had outgrown the woman who created it. By the twilight of her reign, England was a land obsessed with odor. Streets were scrubbed with vinegar. Churches burned incense in her honor. And poets compared her to flowers whose petals never wilt. Her name was synonymous with sweetness. Yet within her heart, Elizabeth knew that her kingdom's fragrance came at a price. The world had learned to fear the natural, to reject the human, to replace truth with artifice. In making England smell divine, she had taught it to forget what being alive smelled like. On certain nights, when the wind carried the scent of the river into her palace, that damp, honest smell of water and mud, the Queen would pause. She would breathe deeply, perhaps remembering the days of her youth, when she ran through gardens, still wet with morning dew. Before the rituals, before the masks, before the law of perfume ruled her life. In those brief moments, she did not gag or recoil. She simply closed her eyes and inhaled, as though reclaiming a lost piece of herself. But by dawn, the windows would close again. The incense would burn anew, and the Queen would return to her throne of roses. And so, part 3 of her story ends not with triumph, but with a question whether Elizabeth I conquered the world through fragrance, or whether fragrance conquered her. For all her power, she remained a prisoner of her own perfection, a woman embalmed in life, worshipped by a nation that had forgotten the difference between holiness and habit. Her scent ruled England, but her soul was fading, one breath at a time. Beneath the endless perfume of her own making, the law was never written on parchment, nor spoken in Parliament. Yet it ruled England as surely as the crown upon her head. It was called by no official name, but everyone in the court knew it, the unbreakable decree of fragrance. To stand before the Queen was to enter a world of scent, so exacting that one's life might depend on it. No soldier's discipline, no poet's wit, No scholar's mind could save a man who offended her nose. The law of scent, invisible yet absolute, became the new order of the Tudor court, reshaping every gesture, every breath, every whisper that passed through those perfumed halls. It began, as many tyrannies do, with good intentions. Elizabeth believed that order was born of purity, that a clean body meant a clean soul. When she looked upon the filth of her cities, she saw rebellion. When she inhaled the stench of her people, she smelled decay of spirit. So she declared, not in words, but through expectation, that all who served her must be cleansed, perfumed, and remade in her image. The courtiers obeyed, at first with eagerness, then with fear. They scented their gloves with crushed violets, soaked their sleeves in wine and lavender, even powdered their wigs with orris and myrrh. Every movement left a trail of fragrance behind them like the smoke of incense before an idol. And in a sense, that was what they had become, worshippers in a temple whose god was cleanliness, whose altar was the queen herself. Those who failed were erased quietly. A diplomat arriving from Spain was said to have carried the scent of garlic and horse from the long journey. He was refused entry, his gifts returned unopened, and his name removed from the list of favored guests. A young page once entered the chamber after running through the garden and forgot to reapply his perfume. The queen, catching the faintest trace of sweat, stopped speaking mid-sentence, turned her face aside, and dismissed the entire gathering. The boy was never seen again in her service. The lesson was carved deep into the minds of every servant and noble alike. The body must be conquered, its nature disguised beneath the veil of civility. The law of scent transformed the palace into a theater of illusion. Every morning, the corridors filled with the music of bottles uncorked, oils poured, flowers crushed. The air shimmered with the mingling of rose, lavender, and amber, so thick, it seemed almost visible. The servants moved silently through the mist, like priests of a fragrant religion, preparing the ground for her arrival. Even the tapestries were perfumed. They absorbed the sweetness until fabric and fragrance were indistinguishable. When Elizabeth entered, her presence dissolved into that aromatic haze. Neither woman nor spirit, but something suspended between. Yet the deeper this ritual rooted itself, the more it revealed its cruelty. Beneath the masks of powder, people began to rot. The perfumes, distilled with mercury and lead, seeped into the pores and poisoned the blood. Hands blistered, lips cracked, lungs weakened from breathing the thick air. But no one dared stop. To appear unscented was to appear disloyal. The queen's obsession became the people's prison. Even letters sent from the palace bore her scent, and those who received them pressed the parchment to their faces, inhaling the trace of power that clung to the ink. In the towns beyond London, merchants began selling Elizabeth's water, a cheap imitation of the royal fragrance that promised grace to anyone who used it. Perfume had ceased to be luxury. It had become doctrine. It was not long before the law of scent extended beyond the palace walls. The noble families of England, desperate to please their monarch, competed in inventing new aromas. Entire fortunes were spent importing foreign oils and powders. Artisans risked their lives distilling dangerous substances in candlelit workshops. A single drop of musk could cost more than a soldier's annual pay. But to smell of musk was to be known as loyal, elegant, and modern. Thus, the invisible law tightened its grip, binding not only courtiers, but the entire ruling class. Fragrance became a symbol of power, as much as heraldry or bloodline. In the midst of this perfumed empire, Elizabeth stood like a statue of alabaster, flawless, yet untouchable. Her faith in fragrance was not mere vanity, it was ideology. To her, the control of scent was the control of nature itself. If a human body could be made to smell divine, then perhaps the corruption of flesh could be erased altogether. Each whiff of perfume was an act of defiance against mortality, a statement that civilization could overcome decay. In this sense, Elizabeth was more alchemist than queen. She was trying to transmute rot into beauty, flesh into spirit, the human into the immortal. But even the most exquisite perfume fades with time. As the years passed, the scent that once charmed ambassadors and poets began to thicken into something oppressive. Visitors complained of headaches, fainting, and nausea. After long audiences, the palace smelled less like heaven and more like a tomb lined with roses. The law of scent, born of purity, had become a machine of suffocation. And somewhere deep inside her, Elizabeth must have known, on some evenings, when the perfumed lamps flickered and the air grew too heavy to breathe, she would dismiss her attendants and open the windows. The night air would rush in cold, rough, carrying the true smell of London smoke, rain, and the river's decay. For a few stolen moments, she would stand there and breathe it in. Perhaps it disgusted her. Perhaps it reminded her that she was still alive. There were those in her circle who tried to speak against the law, cautious souls who feared its excess. One physician, bold and foolish, suggested that the queen's constant use of perfumed powders might be worsening her health. Elizabeth's eyes turned on him like sharpened glass. "Would you have me smell of the grave before I lie in it?" she asked. He never spoke again on the matter. For her, a scent was not just protection, it was identity. To question it was to question her divinity. The law of scent was the final expression of her reign, an invisible crown that weighed heavier than any jewel. And yet, for all its tyranny, there was a strange grace in her madness. The courtiers who lived and died beneath that rule learned to see beauty where others saw obsession. They began to understand that perfume was more than vanity. It was the scent of civilization itself, the fragrance of human longing for purity in a world that would always rot. When Elizabeth finally left this world, the law of scent did not die with her. It lingered in the corridors, in the skin of those who served her, in the rose gardens planted in her memory. Even though, centurilateur, when the air in London thickens after rain and carries a faint sweetness no one can name. Some whisper that it is the ghost of Elizabeth, the queen who made a nation kneel before the invisible. Thus ended the age when fragrance ruled more fiercely than law, and the air itself was loyal to the crown. But in truth, it never really ended. For every era since has carried her lesson that power, like perfume, is invisible, intoxicating, and fleeting. The law of scent remains, not on parchment, but in the secret desires of all who wish to mask what they truly are, beneath the smell of something beautiful. There came a season when even the flowers of England seemed to obey her. Spring no longer smelled of soil or rain, but of imitation, the perfumed echo of roses that had never known the wind. Elizabeth's courtiers began to grow gardens, not for beauty but for fragrance alone, bending nature to please the nose of their queen. Each petal was chosen, bred, and grafted until the garden itself resembled a laboratory. The air within those walls was no longer alive. It was curated, filtered through the will of one woman who refused to let the world decay around her. In this world, the law of scent had become ritual, and ritual had become religion. Every morning, before the bells of Westminster could toll, the Queen's maids of honor entered her chamber barefoot, and silent. They carried with them the tools of devotion, silver basins filled with rose water, jars of ground herbs, and cloths soaked in amber and wine. The scent rose slowly with the light of dawn, soft at first, then overwhelming, until even the air itself seemed drunk on sweetness. They began by washing her hands, then her face, then the delicate skin beneath the lace collar, where no eye ever dared to look. It was not a cleansing of dirt, it was a purification of existence. When they brushed her hair, strands fell across her shoulders like threads of gold, perfumed so heavily with musk that the air shimmered around her head like a halo. Those who saw her in the morning claimed it was as if she had been reborn each day, a divine creature emerging from a baptism of scent. Yet there was no joy in this rebirth, only exhaustion. Elizabeth's body had begun to fail her. The lead in her makeup left pale scars beneath her eyes. The perfume burned her throat when she inhaled too deeply. Still she continued, for to stop was to surrender to the one enemy she had never conquered, time. The scent had become her armor against the slow betrayal of flesh, her veil against the truth that the Virgin Queen was mortal after all. Her ladies whispered that she no longer trusted her reflection. The mirrors of the palace were always draped in gauze or dimmed by candlelight, so that her features appeared blurred, eternal. What she saw each morning was not the face of a woman but of an idea, a myth preserved in amber. And just as the insects trapped in resin cannot escape without breaking themselves apart, so too was Elizabeth trapped within her perfection. The perfume that had once given her freedom now bound her tighter than any chain. Outside, the people adored her. They wrote poems comparing her breath to jasmine, her skin to ivory, her soul to the morning dew. But the poets did not see what her closest attendants saw: the tremor in her hands when the scent grew too strong, the way her eyes watered when the oils burned her skin. She was drowning in fragrance. Yet she smiled through it all, because she understood that the myth could not bleed. The Virgin Queen could not cough, could not sweat, could not stink of life. She had built a world where to be human was to fail. One evening, when the court prepared for a grand banquet, Elizabeth sat alone in her dressing room, the air thick with the fumes of ambergris and wine. A single candle flickered beside her, its flame bent low by the weight of scent. She pressed a perfumed handkerchief to her face, not to smell it, but to breathe through it, as if it might filter the truth from the air. Her lady-in-waiting entered and asked softly whether she wished for more powder. Elizabeth turned, her eyes distant, and said only, "No, I wish to smell nothing." It was a confession, quiet and terrible. The woman who had made the world fragrant longed, at last, for the smell of air. But dawn came, and with it duty. The banquet went on as planned. Ambassadors from every kingdom attended, each wearing the mark of her reign, the sheen of perfume upon their clothes. The room shimmered like a cathedral of scent, each person a candle, burning a different prayer. Elizabeth rose from her throne, her gown rustling like wind through a field of roses, and greeted them all with that same calm grace. Her smile was steady, her presence radiant, and no one saw the faint tremor that rippled through her fingers as she lifted her goblet. They smelled her perfection, and that was enough. The law of scent had become more than etiquette. It had become language. Every fragrance carried meaning: lavender for loyalty, myrrh for mourning, rose for favor, sandalwood for punishment. To wear the wrong perfume was treason without words. Courtiers studied the queen's moods through the air, adjusting their own aromas to match her temperament. Some even claimed to dream in scent, to wake with the ghost of her fragrance on their skin. The entire court breathed her like prayer, each inhale a silent pledge of obedience. In time, perfume ceased to be about the queen's pleasure and became the mechanism of her power. Foreign envoys, desperate to please her, sent barrels of rare oils and distillations from faraway lands. The Ottomans sent attar of roses. The Venetians sent ambergris. And the French, always eager to impress, created a new mixture in her honor. A blend of lilies and civet they called, essence of the sun. Elizabeth accepted every gift, but favored none. For she had long since realized that every scent carried a kind of diplomacy. To accept too eagerly was to reveal weakness. She learned to use fragrance as conversation, to answer flattery with silence scented in roses, or to signal favor with a single drop of musk upon her glove. She had turned perfume into politics, and politics into theater. Yet in the heart of this fragrant empire, decay waited patiently. The queen's teeth, long corroded by sweet wine and powder, caused her constant pain. Her body, wrapped in layers of perfumed silk, no longer knew the touch of air. She slept among her own scents, like a body already embalmed, preserved not for eternity, but for tomorrow's illusion. Still, her will remained unbroken. Each morning, she ordered the same ritual to begin again: the washing, the anointing, the perfuming, as if the repetition itself might convince death to wait. Her courtiers said the queen smelled of heaven. None dared say that she lived like a corpse who refused to admit it. There were nights when she could not sleep. The fragrance around her grew suffocating, and she would rise, barefoot, to walk through the corridors. The torches flickered, and the air trembled with the ghost of roses. She would pause before the tapestries and listen to the silence, to the faint rustle of silk, to the whisper of her own breath. In those hours, she no longer felt like a queen. She felt like a prisoner, wandering through the maze she had built. A maze made of scent, each turn leading her back to herself. And though she would never admit it aloud, she began to wonder if perhaps the rot she feared so much had already taken root, not in her flesh, but in her soul. When dawn broke again, she would return to her throne, composed and radiant, her face painted in calm. The courtiers bowed, and the day repeated itself as all days did. Yet something invisible had shifted. The law of scent, once her greatest triumph, had begun to consume her. What had started as rebellion against decay was becoming its own kind of rot, a sweetness too heavy to bear, a beauty too perfect to breathe. And so the palace continued to shine, its corridors heavy with fragrance, its queen draped in immortality. But under that perfection, beneath every petal and every drop of perfume, something darker stirred the quiet knowledge that no scent, no matter how divine, could ever hide the truth of what it was meant to conceal. And somewhere in that truth waited the beginning of her undoing. The moment when even the queen of fragrance would learn that eternity, like perfume, always fades. There is a point at which perfection begins to rot. When the surface of beauty grows so flawless, it conceals something monstrous underneath. In the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth's palace had become a perfume bottle turned inside out, golden, polished, airless. Every corridor exhaled sweetness, but the sweetness had curdled. What was once the fragrance of grace now clung like illness. The scent no longer floated. It crawled. It settled on curtains, on tapestries, on the queen herself. And within that perfumed tomb, a woman began to unravel quietly behind the painted mask she had built for the world. The mirror was no longer her ally. She would sit before it for hours, her ladies dabbing layers of white lead and rouge onto a face that was no longer skin but canvas. Beneath the paint, her flesh burned and split, the poison seeping deep into her veins. The perfume that covered the stench of decay also fed it, the oils drawing out sickness rather than hiding it. Yet she smiled as the powders were brushed on, smiled as the scent filled her lungs, smiled because she could not afford to stop. For to stop would be to let the truth breathe, that the Virgin Queen was crumbling like the marble of her own statues. Those who served her began to notice the small things first. Her eyes, once sharp as a falcon's, now flickered with suspicion. Her temper, once regal and measured, became unpredictable. A courtier might be rewarded with a diamond one morning and banished by nightfall. The perfumes she demanded grew stranger, heavier. She mixed musks meant for beasts with oils of rose and clove, creating an aroma that was both intoxicating and unbearable. When she walked through the corridors, people turned pale, as if an invisible tide had passed over them. The fragrance that had once announced her majesty now carried something else, the faint trace of fear. At night she no longer slept. The walls of her chamber seemed to close in around her, every surface oozing scent. She would sit upright in her bed, the air so thick she could taste the sweetness on her tongue, and whisper prayers to a god she could no longer feel. Sometimes she would order her ladies to burn more incense, thinking the smoke might cleanse her of whatever haunted her blood. Other times, she would throw open the windows, gasping for the cold air that smelled of rain and rot. The scent of the city, once her enemy, had become her only reminder of reality, proof that beyond her gilded world, life still existed. Unperfumed and unashamed, rumors began to spread, as they always did. They said the queen was growing mad, that she spoke to her reflection, that she smelled death approaching and tried to drown it in roses. Ambassadors wrote home describing her face as a mask of snow over fire. Physicians begged her to abandon the poisons that preserved her image. But she refused. "If I am to die," she said, "I shall die unsullied." It was not vanity that drove her now. It was terror. The terror of decomposition, of being remembered not as eternal, but as flesh. In her mind, fragrance had become faith, and to lose it was to lose herself. The court adapted to her decline in silence. They thickened their own perfumes to match hers, turning audiences into suffocating rituals where the air quivered with competing scents. Conversation became impossible. Each breath burned with spice and flower, yet no one dared leave. To faint in her presence was shame. To cough was treason. Ministers learned to breathe shallowly, their faces powdered white to hide the sweat. The queen's madness had infected the air itself. There were moments, fleeting and terrible, when she seemed to recognize what she had done. Once, while preparing for a procession, she paused before the mirror and asked her maid, "Do I look alive?" The girl, trembling, said yes. Elizabeth stared for a long time, then replied softly, "Then I am not." That night, she ordered every mirror in her chamber to be covered. From then on, she faced the world only through her scent and her mask. Outside the palace walls, the people whispered that the queen no longer aged. They said she had found the secret of eternal youth, that her beauty came from divine favor. But those who caught even a glimpse of her knew otherwise. Her movements were slower, her hands thinner, her mouth a hard line painted red to hide the ruin of her teeth. When she smiled, the cracks showed. When she spoke, the air filled with the heavy sweetness of her perfume, and people wondered if it was meant to charm or to disguise the smell of something dying. The irony was merciless. The woman who had made cleanliness a symbol of order now reeked of corruption, masked as purity. Her perfumes, distilled from rare flowers and exotic oils, had become her shroud. Yet she still held her head high, still presided over her court with that same iron composure. The fear that once protected her had calcified into ritual. Her subjects bowed deeper. Her ladies moved keener, as though the slightest disturbance might shatter her into dust. As her strength waned, she clung harder to ceremony. Every day was choreographed: the anointing of her hands, the changing of her gloves, the lighting of scented candles that burned until the wax turned black. She spoke less, but when she did, her words carried the weight of incense, slow, deliberate, intoxicating. To those who heard her, it was unclear whether they were listening to a ruler or to a ghost. In the final years, when illness began to carve its marks upon her body, Elizabeth forbade anyone to mention death. The courtiers obeyed, pretending not to see the tremors, the faintness, the way her voice cracked when she addressed them. She surrounded herself with fragrance stronger than ever, as if to drown the truth entirely. The palace became unbearable. Even the tapestries dripped with oil, but for the queen, it was the only way to live, to smother the smell of dying beneath the illusion of immortality. They said that when she passed through the halls, the scent lingered long after she was gone. Servants swore they could tell where she had stood by the air alone. And after the audiences, when the rooms were empty and the candles snuffed, the perfume hung heavy, clinging to the stones. It was as if the palace itself was learning to breathe her madness, carrying it forward through the centuries, waiting for the next monarch who might try to mask the truth of power with the same sweet lie. Thus the Virgin Queen's greatest creation, her fragrance, her purity, her myth became her undoing. She had set out to cleanse the world of corruption, but in the end, she had merely painted over it, trapping herself beneath the mask she had made divine. Behind that mask, in the silence between breaths, the scent of roses turned sour, and England's most glorious monarch began to fade, not in battle, not in scandal, but in perfume. Power, when carried too long, begins to decay like flesh sealed beneath silk. In the last years of her reign, Elizabeth's palace no longer smelled of roses or lavender, but of something more ambiguous, a sweetness laced with rot, like fruit left too long on the branch. The perfumes that once symbolized purity had become a veil for something darker. The scent itself began to betray her. It clung not as grace but as guilt, whispering of everything she had, hidden beneath its sweetness, the betrayals, the executions, the ghosts of those who had loved her and died for it. Even the air seemed to judge her, perfumed and silent, watching her rule from behind a veil of amber and regret. She had built her throne from scent and silence, and now both weighed upon her like chains. At council meetings, when her ministers debated war and succession, she sat motionless, her face pale beneath its powder, her gloved hands folded in her lap. The men around her barely noticed that the air had grown heavy, almost suffocating, filled with the musk she favored when anxious. To them, the fragrance meant composure. To her, it was armor. Every drop she wore was a prayer not to God, but to the idea of herself, the Virgin Queen, untouchable by time or flesh. Yet as her power expanded, the boundary between holiness and sin began to blur. There were moments when the mask slipped. A messenger would bring news of rebellion, or the death of another noble, and the queen's calm would fracture for a heartbeat. She would reach for her handkerchief, always perfumed, always ready, and press it to her lips. It was her ritual of control, her way of smothering the stench of fear. For fear did have a scent, sharp and human, and Elizabeth had spent her life denying she could feel it. But the closer death crept, the more she smelled it on herself. She began to sense decay, even in the cleanest rooms. A ghost of odor no perfume could chase away. Her servants called it the curse of the crown. The more she fought against corruption, the more it seemed to grow from within. She had turned the art of fragrance into a kingdom of discipline. Yet her own flesh betrayed her. The poisons in her makeup, the oils she bathed in daily, had begun to poison her blood. She coughed often now, soft and discreet, and her body shook when she rose from her chair. Still, she forbade any mention of illness. The scent, she insisted, was proof of her strength. "While I am sweet," she said once to her physician, "I am still alive." But the sweetness had changed. It was no longer floral, but chemical. No longer délicate, but disparité. In the private hours after midnight, when the palace slept, she would wander through her chambers with a candle, its small flame trembling against the dark. The corridors glowed gold around her, and her shadow stretched across the walls like something that no longer belonged to flesh. She would stop before the portraits her younger self, radiant and untouchable, and stare until the scent of old paint and dust overpowered even her perfumes. It was the only smell in her world that felt honest. Sometimes, in those quiet hours, she whispered apologies to no one, in particular to her mother, to the men she had condemned, to the women who had loved her and feared her, to England itself. She had once ruled by fragrance, but now her scent was all that ruled her. The courtiers who visited her chamber in those years found it difficult to breathe. The tapestries were heavy with oil, the curtains steeped in musk and spice. The air clung to their throats, and yet they praised it, calling it divine. To insult the queen's scent was unthinkable. Some said she had grown more beautiful with age, though what they meant was that her presence was more intoxicating, a haze of incense that dulled the mind. Others confessed in private that it frightened them. It was too perfect, too still, like the air before a storm. Her priests still blessed her as the defender of faith. But Elizabeth herself no longer prayed as she once did. She prayed through ritual now, the burning of incense, the anointing of her wrists, the perfuming of her bed. These had become her sacraments, her daily exorcisms against the smell of mortality. She told her ladies that God could not dwell where there was filth, and that every act of cleansing was a form of worship. But behind her words was a deeper hunger, the wish not to be remembered as a sinner. Her cleanliness had become confession. As her body weakened, her guilt grew stronger. The perfumes could hide her sickness, but not her conscience. The air of the palace carried too many memories. The scent of the execution yard on a rainy morning, the waxy smoke from the pyres of traitors, the salt of tears shed behind closed doors. Each note of fragrance she wore seemed to awaken a ghost. The lavender reminded her of Catherine Howard, who had worn it before the axe fell. The rosewater recalled her mother, Anne Boleyn, whose blood had once stained the same ground. Elizabeth now walked upon the musk, deep and animal, reminded her of the lovers she had denied in order to remain a symbol. Her perfumes were no longer innocent. They were history made liquid, sins distilled into sweetness. One winter evening, as snow drifted against the windows, Elizabeth stood before the fire in silence. Her ladies waited nearby, holding vials of perfume, uncertain whether to approach. The queen extended a trembling hand toward the flames and said, "The air burns cleaner than the body." Then, as if to prove it, she took one of the bottles from them, unstoppered it, and poured the liquid into the fire. The flames flared blue for a moment, hissing out a smell both divine and dreadful. She did not flinch. "Do you see?" she whispered. "Even beauty burns." That night, the palace smelled not of flowers, but of smoke. For days afterward, the courtiers claimed they could still catch traces of it, the ghost of her gesture, the scent of rebellion against her own creation. But the queen said nothing of it again. Instead, she grew keener, almost gentle, as though her fury had turned inward. The fragrances she chose became simpler. Purée lavande, lemon, myrtle. It was as if she was trying to wash herself clean from the inside out. The courtiers mistook it for peace. It was not peace. It was preparation. For beneath all the perfume, Elizabeth knew the truth, that no monarch could perfume away. Every crown carries a smell. Gold smells of sweat and blood. Power smells of sin. And though she had spent a lifetime masking it with roses, she could feel it on her skin now. Faint, but undeniable. The scent of the throne itself. Heavy. Metallic. Human. The queen who had built an empire upon fragrance was finally learning what lay beneath it. And as she sat alone by the fire, her hand resting on the vial, she no longer opened. Elizabeth, the first ruler. Myth. Goddess of purity, began to understand that the sweetest scent of all was the one she had spent her whole life running from the scent of truth. By the time her reign reached its twilight, England itself had become an echo of its queen, perfumed, painted, immaculate, and afraid to breathe. What had begun as a royal quirk had turned into an empire of ritual. Merchants trafficked not in gold or silk, but in fragrance. The ports of London reeked with rose and spice, and even the poor, who could afford no perfume, boiled rosemary in rainwater to scrub the smell of hunger from their hands. To live in Elizabeth's England was to live in a kingdom that worshipped the invisible. The air itself was her monument, and the fragrance within it her crown. The Queen's scent had become a national signature. Poets described England as the island of roses, a land where the air was touched by divine sweetness. Courtiers wrote that visitors could tell they had reached London by smell alone. Long before they saw its towers through the mist, the perfume trade flourished under royal patronage, and apothecaries grew rich, creating tinctures with names that flattered her: Glory of the Maiden, Water of the Virgin Star, Essence of Sovereignty. She had wanted to civilize a world of filth, and in that, she had succeeded. But civilization, like perfume, hides its decay in sweetness. Beneath the scent of roses still festered the same diseases, the same hunger, the same fear of the body she herself had taught them to despise. Inside her palace, the Queen of Perfume presided over a theater of order so delicate that a single breath could undo it. The courtiers who entered her chamber moved as if under water, careful not to disturb the air. They had learned to speak in murmurs, for loud voices broke the illusion of grace. The scent was thick enough to seem alive. It wrapped around them like velvet, pressing against the throat, demanding reverence. To the foreign ambassadors who came to bow, it felt less like a royal court and more like the inside of a reliquary, beautiful, holy, and suffocating. The Queen herself sat beneath a canopy of flowers that never wilted, their scent renewed daily by servants who no longer smelled anything at all. Beyond the palace, the cult of fragrance had spread through every level of society. In the streets, women dabbed vinegar on their wrists and called it perfume. Sailors wore ribbons dipped in lavender to ward off disease. Even the clergy began to scent the altars, claiming that sweet air was closer to heaven. Elizabeth's name had become a synonym for purity, though purity, in her world, meant not being human. The people who adored her did not realize that their queen had long ceased to smell anything natural. Her senses were numbed, her body poisoned by the very oils she demanded. The more fragrant her world became, the less she could breathe. The irony was cruel. She had built a kingdom that smelled eternal. But the scent of eternity was death. The perfumes of her court were distilled from decay, from the bodies of whales, from the musk of animals slaughtered for their glands, from flowers crushed and left to rot. The sweetness of power. She realized they was always born from something dying, yet she continued to adorn herself in it, unable to stop, for the illusion was all she had left. Each morning, as her maids brushed the fragrant powders across her skin, she thought of the empire beyond her walls, ships bearing her flag, carrying her scent to the corners of the world. England, perfumed and proud, now believed itself chosen by heaven. But heaven, she knew, did not smell like this. One night, a storm broke over London. The wind tore through the palace gardens, scattering petals across the marble floor. The queen stood at her window, watching the rain erase the careful order of her flowers. For the first time in years, she smelled something raw, the wet soil, the iron tang of lightning, the world without artifice. It was not pleasant, but it was real. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. And for a moment, she could almost remember the girl she had been, barefoot, wild, laughing under the same sky, before perfume became her armor. Then the thunder rolled, and she turned away. By morning, the maids had swept the dirt away. The air once again, restored to perfection. But something inside her had shifted. The kingdom of perfume she had built now seemed to mock her. Its sweetness tasted false, its purity empty. The courtiers still praised her radiance. Yet when she looked into their eyes, she saw only fear. They feared her not because she was strong, but because she was fading, and they could not imagine England without the scent that had defined it. She was no longer a ruler, but a relic, embalmed while still alive. The poets continued to write of roses, and the priests continued to burn incense in her name. But the queen no longer joined them. She began to refuse the heavier perfumes, asking only for linen washed in water. Her attendants thought it madness, another sign of decline. But Elizabeth was not mad. She was remembering what the world smelled like before she drowned it in sweetness. The first rain of her youth, the wood smoke of her father's court, the scent of her mother's hair when she was lifted from the cradle, memories unperfumed, fragile and true. In those final months, she rarely spoke. When she did, her voice carried the same quiet authority it always had. But her words were gentler. The air must be allowed to breathe. She told her ladies, even the roses must sleep. They nodded, but they did not understand. To them, the queen's scent was her soul, and they feared its loss more than her death. Yet Elizabeth had come to see that fragrance could not stop the end. It could only delay the rot. And perhaps, she thought, rot was necessary. Without it, nothing could bloom again. When she walked through the halls now, the courtiers bowed lower than ever, because they could barely recognize her. She had stopped wearing powder, and her face, pale and scarred, seemed almost human again. The perfume still lingered, but faintly, like a memory retreating. The kingdom she had perfumed into existence would outlive her. But it would also decay as she did. The scent of roses would fade into dust. And England would learn once more the smell of truth, of wood, of sweat, of life. And when she closed her eyes at last, the palace did not smell of death. It smelled of rain. The night she died, England held its breath. Outside the palace, the wind moved slowly through the gardens, carrying the scent of rain and the faint sweetness of wilted flowers. Inside, the air was still. The tapestries that once shimmered with perfume had grown heavy with age, and the candles burned low, their smoke curling like the ghosts of forgotten prayers. Elizabeth lay upon her bed, the last queen of her house, surrounded by silence and scent, the twin emblems of her reign. The fragrance that had once filled every corner of her world had softened into something fragile, almost human. For the first time in nearly half a century, the air in her chamber smelled not of roses or musk, but of breath and time. She had not spoken for days. Her attendants watched over her in hushed terror, unsure whether to pray or to weep. They said she refused the priest, refused the bedclothes, refused even the touch of comfort. She would not be wrapped, she said. Like a corpse, she sat upright for hours, her body thin and rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. When her ladies begged her to rest, she whispered, "I will rest when the scent fades." No one understood what she meant, but they obeyed. They always obeyed. As dawn approached, a strange calm settled upon her. The long years of vigilance seemed to lift from her shoulders, and in their place came the quiet of release. She asked for the windows to be opened. The maids hesitated. The wind was cold, the hour near freezing, but she insisted. When the shutters swung wide, the scent of wet earth and smoke rolled into the room, raw and unfiltered. It mingled with the faint trace of her perfume until the two became indistinguishable, the world and the woman, meeting at last without disguise. For a moment, she smiled. Those who were present said it was the gentlest expression they had ever seen on her face. "The air is honest tonight," she said softly. Her voice was barely audible, but the words lingered like the echo of prayer. Then she closed her eyes and drew a long, trembling breath, the last act of a life spent trying to control the air itself. The breath went out, and with it the fragrance that had ruled a kingdom. The queen of perfume was gone. They say that when her heart stopped, a strange silence fell over the palace, deeper than any before. The servants who entered her chamber expected the thick sweetness of death, but instead they found something else, the faintest trace of lavender, clean and simple, as if the air itself had been purified. Some swore that the scent remained for days, clinging to the curtains, the floor, even the skin of those who touched her body. Others claimed that when the wind blew from the Thames, it carried her fragrance across the city, through the markets and over the fields, a final benediction from a queen who had ruled through scent alone. When the time came to lay her to rest, the priests burned incense so heavily that the chapel filled with smoke, yet beneath it, people said, one could still catch a whiff of something finer, the queen's own perfume. Faint but unyielding, it drifted above the candles, mingled with prayer, and seemed to bless the mourners as they wept. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps it was merely habit, but in that moment, no one doubted that Elizabeth's spirit still lingered, invisible and fragrant, watching over the kingdom she had shaped in her image. After her death, England changed. The new reign brought new laws, new vars, new gods to worship. But the habit of fragrance endured. The courtiers continued to powder their wigs and scent their gloves. The merchants continued to trade in oils and roses. And every woman who wore perfume did so with the unconscious echo of the Queen's command. The scent of power had become part of England's soul. It hung in the air for centuries, carried in every drop of rosewater that graced a noblewoman's wrist. Every candle burned at a coronation. Every whispered legend of the Virgin Queen. But time, like scent, fades. The perfumes of her court dissolved into dust. The recipes forgotten. The meaning of her rituals lost to comfort and fashion. What remained was the story, the strange truth of a monarch who believed that to rule the world, one must first rule the air. Historians would argue whether it was genius or madness, faith or fear. Some would say she conquered nature itself. Others would say she merely disguised it. Yet in the quiet hours of England's memory, when the rain still falls upon stone, when the wind carries the smell of wet roses, there is always the faintest reminder of her. It is said that the scent of roses drifts strongest near her tomb in Westminster Abbey. Though no flowers are placed there, some call it coincidence, others devotion. But perhaps it is something simpler, the last breath of a woman who refused to let the world forget her, even in death. For in the end, Elizabeth I achieved what no monarch had before she made her soul eternal. Not through bloodline or conquest, but through the air itself. And so the tale closes as it began, with a fragrance, not the suffocating sweetness of power, nor the cloying perfume of vanity, but the soft, fleeting scent of rain on stone, the scent of truth, the scent of a queen finally freed from her mask, the scent of the world she left behind imperfect, human, and alive.